Epilogue. In Memoriam. Brenda Jean Campbell, 1954 to 2019. For those of you who have reached this far in the book, it seems unfair to leave you with a loose end, so to speak. Time has passed since we left the story above. Brenda is safely beyond the veil now and beyond the reach of further pain. She would certainly want you to know the rest of her story. She has asked me to finish it. A friend had just moved to Houston, and there were a lot of jobs. Come down and take a look. Brenda Jean Donovan finished her cigarette that morning. The words from that man, her father, the horrible ghostly words still reverberating in her mind. I'll always love my little girl. What gave her the strength to carry on? Was it the strict but always fair upbringing in her grandparents' house? Or maybe Jamie's insistence that she really was beautiful and desirable, and not as her own father saw her, an object, a nobody to poke his flesh into. Or it may have simply been her grit and refusal to knuckle under any more to any one or any mere circumstance of living. She would survive, just to spite the world, if nothing else. You think I'd crumble? You think I'd lay down and die? Oh no, not I. I will survive. Oh, as long as I know how to love, I know I'll stay alive. I've got all my life to live, and I've got all my love to give, and I'll survive. I'll survive. She sang this song, the radio in her black Mercury Monarch cranked up to full, as she turned onto Interstate 95 on the way across the country to this job land described to her as Houston, Texas. Tracy was belted in the passenger seat, playing with a small trinket Brenda found for her at a recent stop to get gas. These were her only possessions, save for her washer-dryer she was towing, the only thing left from the house in North Carolina. Her former boss from Fort Bragg, Commander Taylor Williams, had sent her the newspaper from Houston, that land where just the want-ad section was as big as the entire Fort Bragg Advocate edition on Sunday. She dare not get too excited after her last experience, working at the local burger hut. She could advance in the company if she just slept with a manager, which she did not. But the sheer volume of jobs listed gave her a glimmer of hope, something she had been missing for a long while. Commander Williams had given Brenda a brief description of this new part of the United States she had never seen before. She had grown almost used to the unremittingly flat lowlands driving across Florida, then eventually into Louisiana. She began mindlessly counting the click-clack of the highway seams, crossing bridge after wrought iron bridge of dead, still water, which turned into invisible sheets of nothingness after nightfall. Then it began to rain. Again. Her mind wandered upon unlikely what-if scenarios, like a slide off of the road should her tow trailer decide to aquaplane on her. She shuddered to think what the dark, foreboding waters held, besides the sea of dead trees that stretched out to the Gulf of Mexico. Alligators, most likely. Ugh. She checked her speed and let her foot off the gas by another 5 miles an hour. Up ahead, she could just make out the green and white lettered sign, Beaumont, 50 miles. The rain had turned cool, then cold. Brenda flipped the wipers on medium speed to keep the windshield clear. It was January, to be sure, but the cold was penetrating and unlike the winter she was used to back home. She flipped the defroster up a notch to keep the inside glass clear as well. It must be the humidity. Just another few miles to go, and then it started to snow. Brenda had been correctly advised. The terrain across Louisiana and Texas was uniformly flat, which had been a relief to her after navigating the mountains and hills coming down I-95, then across I-40 out of the mountains and hills of Alabama and Georgia. This sudden spate of snow was a bit bizarre, being in the deep south, but Brenda was willing to overlook that. Just ahead, however, the mist broke momentarily, and she made out what looked like, yes, it must be a bridge. A very big bridge. The sign read, Port Arthur Orange Bridge. But Brenda hadn't imagined anything this tall since she crossed the Mississippi. The lanes looked like they went up at a 45-degree angle at the top of the arch. Thinking quickly, Brenda noticed several 18-wheelers in the middle lanes, acting almost like cowcatchers on the front of a train, clearing the snow as they moved slowly in the swirling mists of rain and sleet. Brenda took a deep breath, checked her mirrors, and fell in behind the trucks, her wheels cracking the ice, but moving more easily into the freshly broken snow. After a few nerve-wracking minutes, she managed to edge the Monarch and her little trailer up and over the huge structure. Normally, she would have gazed out over the bridge for a view, but not this time. She kept her eyes fixed to the bumper of the nearest truck in front of her and tapped the brakes ever so gently as the convoy of vehicles made its way down the other side. She would have a few choice words for her commander about that little episode, she told herself. Flat land my ass, she thought. Tracy slept through the whole process, which was just as well. Brenda had to pull over at the next rest station to compose herself and double-check the map. She would find out later that the snow in South Texas on January 1st, 1980, was a once-in-a-century event. And it had to happen on my first trip to Houston, she thought to herself. Looking at the map, there didn't seem to be any further obstacles on the last leg of her trip. She vaguely remembered knocking on the door of Taylor Williams' apartment and pitching Tracy and a few luggage items onto the bed before she fell into her first good sleep since leaving the East Coast. I begged you not to go, but you said goodbye, and now you're telling me all your lies. I hear you knocking, but you can't come in. I hear you knocking, go back where you been. Knocking, knocking, that long black cloud is coming down. I feel I'm knocking on heaven's door. Knock, knock, knocking on heaven's door. What's all that knocking anyway? Say what? What? I said knock, knock, Brenda. You okay? Shaking the cobwebs from her dreams, Brenda rolled over and opened one eye and was gazing toward the strange door. She thought she recognized the voice on the other side. Brenda, you okay? Suddenly it made sense. Oh, hi, Will. Yep, I'm awake. I think. Give me a minute. Brenda gingerly felt for the floor under her feet in this new place and realized her luggage was still next to her, but Tracy was missing. After one panicked moment, she realized she must be in Taylor Williams' apartment, and Tracy would have bounced out of bed looking for breakfast if it was anywhere near morning. Was it? What time is it, Will? The voice boomed from the other side of the door. What day, you mean? Sleepyhead, it's about 7 o'clock at night. You got in early this morning and have been asleep all day. Tracy's having some dinner. If you want some, I can fix you a plate. Thanks, I'll be right out. 12 hours passed. This time, Brenda heard no knocking, but she felt the warmth of a morning sun on her face. My gosh, how long have I been sleeping? She thought sheepishly. Looking at her watch, she could just make out a 7 and a second hand on the 3. Good, 7:15. Looks to be a.m. I better go pee. Brenda washed her face in the small adjoining bathroom, checked her face in the mirror, and made her appearance outside the doorframe of the room she'd slept in non-stop for the past 24 hours. Hi, Mom, Tracy called out from her place at the kitchen table. She was dangling her legs off a couple of phone books Will had set up for her booster seat. She was happily downing a stack of pancakes, drizzling syrup as she spoke. Well, good morning, sleepyhead, Will called out, turning away momentarily from his skillet. So glad you decided to join us. Oh, Will, I'm so sorry. Can you just tell me what day this is? She looped her fingers around the cup for coffee being dangled in front of her. Well, let's see. You and Tracy got in here late Thursday night, and today is Saturday. So. Brenda shook her head in disbelief. Oh, wow. I knew I was tired, but I had no idea I would crash like that. Will laughed as he passed Brenda a plate full of pancakes. Welcome to your first meal in your new home state. For that matter, your new home, at least for a while. Brenda was about to reach for the plate, then impulsively walked over to her former commander, giving him a big hug. "Will, I can't tell you how grateful I am that you would let me and Tracy stay with you, temp housing, so to speak, until I can figure out what I can do in this town." Brenda circled the table, setting her plate down next to Tracy. "I mean, you sent me the paper, which was good news all by itself, but I honestly had no idea where we could possibly stay once I got here." "Houston's a lot bigger than Fayetteville, Brenda, let me tell you. I figured it was at least something I could do for you, considering what a jam you were in. It may take you some time to get settled, depending on where you find a job." "Some jam is right," Brenda agreed, adding some more syrup to her pancakes. "After Harry literally walked out on the house note, the day we signed the papers, Will." Taylor Williams shook his head in agreement. "I know, you wrote me all about that. Of course he's still enlisted, right? You're entitled to a part of his check, as long as the Army keeps him." "I know," Brenda added, starting on her second pancake. "It still wasn't enough for me to keep the house, or probably pay rent here in Houston." "Well, take a look at those want ads, and I think you'll find a wide assortment to pick from. I retired from the Army, so I just keep papers like that for Buddy." Tracy looked up from her third pancake. "Yeah, Mr. Williams, where is Buddy?" Will glanced behind him towards the bedroom. "Oh, he's around here somewhere. You hold out a piece of that pancake long enough, he'll find you." They all laughed, and as if on cue, a small brown and white chihuahua clicked across the linoleum floor of the apartment and sat expectantly at Tracy's side. "He must have heard the magic word pancake," Will added, with a wink. Brenda did look through the want ads that day and for several days after, and was able to brush up on her interview skills in the process, as she also familiarized herself with the city. In the end, she had to decide between a civil service job and a job in HR with a private company, which paid an extra 10 cents an hour. She took the extra 10 cents. Life moved on and became a lot more stable than it had for a long time, but she felt uneasy and could not quite figure out what it was that bothered her. At first she thought it was her living arrangements. Taylor Williams was a good friend, but each night the dining room conversation seemed to drift a little too uncomfortably to her sleeping arrangements. Taylor Williams was old enough to be her father, and, well, there would be no more of that, she was sure. In a few months she moved to her own apartment, and life took on some semblance of stability, with work and taking Tracy to her new school, but Friday nights became a boring routine she wanted to change. She would occasionally date guys from the office. Sometimes she did want more of that, but each encounter left her more empty rather than fulfilled. She was searching for something, she didn't know what. Then there were the dreams. She had put such things out of her mind for a long time, but she could still recall the talk with her grandmother in Hagerstown, except no actual words were ever exchanged. Her grandmother warned her to never reveal this ability, that it would be a secret between them. Brenda recalled that, and dreams of people she did not know, but sometimes she would pass a vaguely familiar face in the store and wonder, did I just dream of that person? Sometimes she saw them twice. The first time, they would appear somewhat ill, and then she would see them in a dream where she would touch their hand or forehead, and days or weeks later, they would be passing her in the store again, this time looking healthy. What was this connection to strangers? It made no sense, except to make her doubt her own mind. She used the Friday night dates almost as a relief from the pressures of her daily work and taking care of Tracy and those night dreams. Eventually, one of the male co-workers talked her into moving in with him, and she tolerated that for a while, but decided no, she was better off alone. There were too many secrets she dared not share. She was pulled in her dreams to pack up and literally move to an apartment across town, which in Houston is to say 20 miles or more, and she did not know why that became an available option either. It was as if she was being guided. Many nights were lonely. Some were filled, but only temporarily, and then there were those dreams. One Friday in particular, She was waiting for the office guy to come take her out, but it was already 7:30 at night. This was irritating. What, did he decide to stand her up? Brenda glanced once more at her watch and considered calling off the evening, but changed her mind. "Tracy?" she called out to the bedroom. "Yes, Mom." "Come on. We're going to Miss Polly's." "Okay," from the bedroom. Brenda dropped Tracy off at the sitter and went on to the club, date or not. She deserved her night out, damn it. She had already paid for the babysitter, so she was going to enjoy her evening regardless. She usually ordered a tequila sunrise, as was her habit on most dates, and nursed the drink for an hour or so. She felt rather blue and a bit sorry for herself. There had been several men besides Jamie and Harry. Some had money, some had good looks, and a few even had both at the same time. But the one thing she searched for was the one thing she never found. She wanted someone in her life who was genuinely kind. This seemed to be some odd commodity that was unavailable in the male population. At the club she sat idle, occasionally shooing away men who approached her. She did not feel like putting up with any of it tonight. She scanned the room, and for some reason she paused at one particular group of 2 men and 2 women. The one man in the middle seemed interesting. Oh well, what's the use, Brenda thought. They're evenly matched. One of those women must be his partner. This was the first time she had seen Robert, and at that moment she knew he was the kindest person in the room. Robert Owen had not wanted to go out that night. His mother, for some reason, had been wanting to visit this club for a week and wanted him to go as well. Did she think he would meet women? Women never talked to Robert. Heck, women never even noticed Robert. But if it would make his mother happy, he would acquiesce. His sister and her fiancé agreed to come along. It's difficult to place children in the middle of a divorce, but in this case it was to be a family affair, a show of solidarity for Mom. Robert would go after all. Robert sat rather sullenly at the table that night. There was a live band, and the music washed over the crowd, making normal chatter almost impossible. He glanced up and noticed a rather pleasant woman, illuminated as if under a spotlight, seated by herself toward the back of the room. Pleasant because she was smiling. In his direction. Oh, that's right, Robert mused. We're probably blocking her view of the people behind us or the band. He stirred his drink and couldn't help himself. He looked her way again. She smiled again, a bit bigger this time. Well, this is new, Robert thought to himself. I wonder what she's looking at. He looked down. Nope, nothing there. All zipped up. She smiled even bigger this time. Okay, that does it, Robert said almost audibly. I've got to find out who she is. Brenda watched the young man with the befuddled look on his face and could almost read his thoughts. It was cute to watch his indecision. She looked down to her purse, checking to make sure she had her tip money. It was almost 9:45. She looked up, but he was gone. Oh well, Brenda thought. He looked awfully young anyway. Geez, he might have been 19. Just then, a shadow crossed her table. Hi, my name is Robert. I'm 27, but I just had to find out. What are you looking at that was so fascinating for you? And why did I just say that? Robert cringed inwardly at this awkward introduction. Brenda smiled again. He had just answered her biggest question so far. Sometimes the universe can deliver immediate answers if the question is focused and true. Please sit down, Robert. My name is Brenda. Nice to meet you. They talked late into the night. The bar announced last call, and, following her intuition, she invited him back to her apartment. This was not something Brenda would normally do, but this one had something special. Her intuition told her she could trust him. It was that kindness she kept feeling, and it was a feeling she wanted very badly in her life and had for a long time. The talk was easy, like between old friends. It helped her forget times past and the night when she slept. The first rumbles started about 7 o'clock in the morning. It was Monday, the busiest day of the week. Vendors were just beginning to set up their shops, ratcheting up their corrugated tin sliding doors and pulling back the wrought iron burglar bars of their designated storefronts. She looked up to see a blue signpost covered in ornate calligraphy that was obviously foreign, but when she looked again, the words Dhaka Plaza stared back at her, plainly outlined in white. She moved down the street looking into faces at once strange, dark, and yet friendly, and she recognized the universal bustle of market day known worldwide and needing no translation. Moving further down the narrow path between the stalls, she could see a blue horizon, just between a cow and the herdsman up ahead. The streets widened now at the end of the shopping district, and all the buildings fell away into a flat blue line, extending from left to right, encompassing the entire field of view. Tiny dhows dotted the shimmering blue water, their dark nets strung out behind. The sea was covered with them like many breadcrumbs on an azure blue counterpane. The idyllic scene only frightened her that much more, and she waved her hands frantically as if to say, "Come back! Hurry!" A dark feeling of foreboding overcame her, and she heard the ominous rumbles before she felt them. There was the sound of faintly rolling thunder amid an absolutely clear blue sky, and Brenda knew then what it was. She began running down to the beach, passing a few casual shoppers, reaching out to them, touching them on the shoulder as if to say, "Run! Run now!" But no one seemed to notice her terror. The sound increased, and the earth began to shake beneath her feet, her vision blurring now with the increasing vibration. Back towards Dhaka Plaza, crowds broke and ran nowhere in particular, and she began hearing the cacophony of shouting and yelling of people frightened together. The idea of an earthquake was a simple thing, and she had almost accepted it, until she turned around to face the sea and knew the tsunami was coming. The color drained from her face as she watched it, gathering strength 5 miles offshore and coming fast. This blue-green terror would cover all as if it had never been, and there was nothing she could do but scream. She heard an odd buzzing in her head and knew that no alarm could help her or the people in Dhaka Plaza now. Monday was the first official workday for Brenda, but that was no reason to swipe the buzzing alarm clock off the nightstand for simply announcing its arrival. Brenda sat up in bed, her teeth clenched, hands clutching the sheet, her eyes wide and the sheet damp with perspiration, as she looked around the room and realized it was only a dream. That was what she wanted to believe. She closed her eyes and took a few deep breaths, registering the familiar walls of her small apartment before getting up. Brenda made a determined effort to wash her face, then put her hair up in a towel before padding out to the kitchen to snap on the coffee pot. She was still trembling as she walked past the TV, flipping it on and letting it warm up while she took her shower. Alternate waves of terror and relief washed over her as she sat with her coffee, watching the news announcer describe a 7.0 earthquake outside Bangladesh. Brenda knew that dreams seldom affect your emotions so strongly. Only reality could do that. She could still smell the faint odor from the Bay of Bengal, and her heart knew what her mind dismissed. It was no dream she had last night. She was there. Still shaking, she toweled off, pulled on a suitable skirt and blouse, and walked back in the bathroom to inspect her face, dismayed at the dark circles under her eyes. "Geez, I hate it when I can't sleep," she exclaimed, daubing some makeup in the right places. What she meant to say was, she hated the earthquake dream last night, and the volcano in Indonesia the month before that. The previous winter, a DC-9 went down in the Potomac. She was cold for a month after that. "Tracy, are you ready for school?" A little girl swung around the corner, smiling. "Here I am, Mom. I was just getting my books." "Good girl," Brenda replied, glad that the child was so self-motivated on days like this. She had been hard on Tracy after the divorce, maybe too hard, but she had to do it. People were convinced that if Brenda told Tracy to jump out of the apartment window, it would happen without question. Brenda merely considered it good training. In only a few more years, the little girl might have the dreams too, and Brenda knew she was the only one who could explain it. "See you after school," Brenda called out, dropping her daughter off at the local daycare center. The little girl waved, a receding image in the rearview mirror as Brenda headed for the office. The usual stack of folders was piled on the desk as Brenda rounded the corner of her cubicle with her second cup of coffee. She wasn't sure why she slowed as she rounded the corner, but found out soon enough. "Good morning, Mr. B. What brings you here?" "Good morning, Brenda. Whoa, watch that coffee." "I just wanted to leave you the resumes for the new hires this week." Mr. Baxter held up both hands to ward off Brenda's coffee. "First one is scheduled to interview with you at 9. "Okay," Brenda replied, checking her watch automatically. Mr. B noticed the momentary grimace, pulled down his bifocals across his nose, and smiled. "I know how you hate early morning appointments, Brenda, but these couldn't wait. Too bad both of us are afternoon people." Brenda recovered herself. "Oh, Mr. B, it's okay. I'll just get this coffee down and I'll be good to go." "Atta girl." Mr. B returned to his office, still smiling. Brenda's habits of coming in later in the morning were often due to sleepless nights. That girl needed to get married. Mr. B figured it was insomnia. He did not know about the dreams. Neither could she tell anyone how she dreaded the personal interviews now piled on her desk. Brenda was certainly not a social wallflower, but she was very careful about how she approached people. She preferred to learn about them slowly, for she was a receptor. Some people simply receive information about others automatically, like a radio signal. This was not a voluntary thing either. The information simply came, and there was no way to filter it, dilute it, or postpone it in any way. The good news was the information only came with direct contact. The bad news was Brenda would have to shake hands with every single applicant this week. Still, there was some preparation she could do. She sat down and flipped open the top folder marked Fuentes, William, and turned to the last page under the heading Medical History. She started reading. So far so good, but even the file folders couldn't always help. She remembered the middle-aged man who applied for one of the warehouse positions last week. "Good morning, Mr. Abernathy," Brenda had said pleasantly enough. It had been a perfect morning until then. She reached out to shake his hand, and almost immediately she felt a wave of nausea. Mr. Abernathy continued saying something as Brenda struggled to catch her breath, feeling a constriction in her chest, as if the circulation had been cut off. By the time Mr. Abernathy had finished speaking, Brenda had almost completely cleared away the gray tunnel vision that had begun to surround her. Luckily, Mr. Abernathy noticed nothing out of the ordinary. The interview went just fine, and by Friday, Mr. Abernathy was back at Brenda's desk, completing the insurance paperwork. "Never had a sick day in my life," the new employee crowed. "Are you sure I should sign up for full medical coverage?" Brenda kept her composure and stared back at him evenly, remembering the first day she met him and knew exactly what it meant. "Oh yes, Mr. Abernathy. I think you really should take out full coverage." That was all she could say. It was all she wanted to say. She had always had the feeling about other people, the same way she had a feeling about every Christmas present or birthday gift she ever received. It was as simple for her as reading the words off a page, and less time-consuming. Her relatives gave her a special look whenever she did these things, and she learned to avoid that look whenever possible. She learned to act surprised, along with everybody else on Christmas Day, keeping the truth safe within herself. Not everyone could handle the truth. She thumbed through the folders, stopping at the 6th one. It read, "Currently taking chemotherapy treatments." Brenda shuddered and made a note to let Mr. B do that one. This afternoon she could help payroll anyway. After that, she could do the filing for Mary Perkins, out on maternity leave, check on the status of the latest vehicle purchases for the fleet pool, then contact the dealer for the latest discounts. Brenda never stopped to consider that she was consistently doing the work of 3 people. It wasn't important. It was only important to keep busy and not have time to think about the rest. Her daughter often said she was like a different person at home, and it was true. At home, there was too much time to think and feel, but at work, she could keep herself as busy as possible, living on the surface of life, treading water atop the endless sea of emotion that surrounded her. There was no one she could share these feelings with, not even her daughter, not yet. No one would possibly understand. They would call the authorities, like her grandparents had done. And she was never going back to the psychiatric ward in this lifetime, of that she was sure. The friends she made, she kept on the surface of her life, but her thoughts were hers, alone and cold in the night, where she could never share. She had already been through psychoanalysis and knew there was no more truth to her than what she had already faced every day and night. There was too much truth, too much of the time, for just one person to hold in their heart, and she knew it would be that way forever and ever. Amen. Sometimes she could actually help people, but just as often she could only witness the pain of others or turn away. She understood why people from Jesus to Elvis had to get away from the maddening crowd sometimes. There were so many others who felt more than their own pain, and for this they received no recompense nor recognition, except to be who they were, for as long as they lived. Some people thought she was cold and unfeeling, but quite the reverse was true. It took all her effort to keep the hopes and fears of the world at bay, and allow room for a life of her own. Tonight there would be another long drive from the office, when she could relax and enjoy the simple mechanics of driving. She would pick up her daughter from school and cook a small supper for them both, before wrapping herself in her pink fuzzy robe and watching an hour or so of mindless television. The evening was almost a complete success until 2 a.m., when she had the recurring dreams again, usually of death, destruction, or both. Brenda usually awoke with a start, as if she had been sucked up into a tornado, flung across the universe, and eventually slammed back into her own body. What just happened? She often had no clear memories, just a vague remembrance of faces in a crowd somewhere. Opening her eyes again, the apartment window pane glowed gently in shades of early light, and she knew it was only Tuesday. It was going to be a long work week. This was the life Brenda had accepted, and also why she looked forward to her Friday night outing so urgently. It gave her a respite that made her feel normal, like the other office workers around her. She yearned for a relief she had yet to find. Chatting easily that first evening with Mr. Owen, or should I call him Robert? Brenda decided to test the water and tell him about her dream about the Potomac air crash and the other dream, even worse. I felt so helpless, she said. Why would I have such a premonition if there was nothing I could do about it? You have a gift, Robert said gently. I'm about as psychic as a rock, but there are some people out there with special talents, and I think you're one of them. Some gift, Brenda replied with a feeling of melancholy. You just don't know the whole story, I bet. God would not give you the information unless he had a reason for it. Robert leaned over and kissed her gently. He stayed with her that night with the intention of it being till death do us part. The attraction had been immediate and reciprocal. Jamie had been a wonderful friend and lover, and had saved her life in more ways than one, but Brenda had been in charge of saving her own life in the years since, and had never come across anyone like Robert. She had found someone with empathy, a sympathetic soul, whose gentle acceptance she had never experienced. Later that same year they married, and Brenda felt she was home at last. Robert often recalled the first time she lay in his arms, and he was intrigued by her comment. It ticks. What? Robert did a quick mental scan, immediately searching for flaws in his anatomy. Brenda smiled languidly, pointing at the watch on his wrist. It ticks. Robert paused for a moment, considering whether this woman was mentally impaired or inspired by some of the thought process. Well, yes, it does. Why do you ask? I don't know. It just makes me feel better. Robert tucked that comment away for future reference until later in their time together, and eventually concluded that Brenda, who spent so much of her time on the other side, out of time, so to speak, must have felt a strange comfort in the precise countdown of his watch. It reminded her that she really did have a home in the mortal coil of time, a home with Robert. His watch was a comforting reminder to her, but that did not stop her dreams. Still, she was able to live a life she had once thought impossible. With the unconditional love from her husband, she began to hope for a forever future of peace and contentment. In 1984, she gave birth to another daughter. Using her VA benefits, Brenda was able to complete college. She hoped to contribute to the household finances, but full-time work seemed to avoid her now. It didn't help that she was often called away. At any given moment, she might glance at Robert, who was usually at the computer typing up his lesson plans for the next day, turn her attention back to the kitchen sink or the dining room table, where her own work projects waited, only to abruptly pause. "I need to take a nap, Robert. I'm being called." With that, she would withdraw to the bedroom, and closing her eyes, the dreams would come. When she opened her eyes again, she was only aware of a forest around her. As she sat up, she saw a stone table or desk, surrounded by some stone benches. The sun shone brightly, illuminating the forest. It was a comforting place, a sanctuary she had visited many times before, always in her dreams. From out of the forest, a tall being emerged. He seemed almost transparent. Even the leaves and flowers seemed to shine more brightly as he stepped down the path. "Hi, Jerry," Brenda called out, happy to see her friend. "Hello, Brenda," he replied. "We are pleased you are well. Thank you for coming." "I'm always happy to help," Brenda said gently. They were soon joined by a small crowd of others, much like Jerry, and the discussions seemed to go on for hours. She could never remember the exact words and phrases, but there was usually a task she needed to perform, a person she needed to visit, and these others were there to give their advice. After the discussion, she would close her eyes, and turning her head to one side, she could see a clock, this time in her own bedroom. 22 minutes had passed. "I'm back," Brenda would announce, walking back into the living room of her home. She often felt refreshed, actually. "How's Jerry these days?" Robert would call out casually. She had told him of the dreams and those she met there. "You know he's fine, Robert. Quit being silly," Brenda replied, brushing the back of his head with her fingers playfully. Robert had come to accept these absences, even if he did not understand them. "I mean, the guy has an actual name, right?" he continued, still musing over his lesson plan. "Yes, he does. But he told it to me when I was a little girl, and it was too hard for me to pronounce, so he said I could call him Jerry." "So did they have any good news today?" Robert added. "You know I hardly remember what they tell me, Robert," Brenda replied, refilling her coffee cup before returning to her work. Robert sighed. "I hope they realize how much this takes out of you, Brenda." "They take good care of me, Robert. Don't worry about that." She turned back for one last remark. "Oh, by the way, Lois says you need to run." Robert looked at her. "Well, I do feel a pinch down in my back sometimes. It must be from sitting at a computer desk all day." "Well, you've been told," Brenda said simply, returning her attention to her task. "Tell her thank you for me," Robert added. "Tell her yourself. She can hear you." Brenda and Robert were solitary souls, not given to party-going or events, and they liked it that way. Brenda had an aversion to crowds, and she remembered one in particular. She had met a small study group in college, and eventually they began to meet at Brenda's house on weekends. Homework was discussed, but inevitably talk drifted to personal events. Deanna was currently looking around her apartment for a missing necklace her mother had given her. The girls each chimed in, offering their opinion. Brenda brought a tray of cookies out from the oven and glanced toward the table of women. "Try looking in a round chest of drawers, something like a wooden box with strings," she said absently. At that suggestion, Deanna made a note to look for the box later when she got home. "Thank you, Brenda. I have no idea what that is, but I'll check." And sure enough, at the next weekend meeting, Deanna was wearing the necklace. "I must have stuck it in a little jewelry box with fringe on top years ago and put it in the dresser before we moved. Would you believe it?" "Yes," Brenda said simply. This event led to other events, and upon each meeting, Robert noticed a couple of extra attendees. Just how many people were in this class, he wondered. After a while, he saw that the discussions were far from business or economics class and settled on topics that only he and Brenda had discussed privately. One of the girls in the class had a cut on her hand. Brenda had just returned from the bathroom for some peroxide when, after a few dabs, she stopped and looked at the girl intently. "Eva, it looks like you definitely have an upcoming life decision to make. Were you thinking of changing your major?" Eva blanched, but clearly she was intrigued. "Wow! How do you know that, Brenda? I really have been considering moving from business administration to the restaurant school. Do you think that's a good idea? A whole new line of conversation opened up at Brenda's house after that. Robert decided he better take notes as the questions and answers mounted each weekend. Brenda, notoriously private, was being asked what she knew about reincarnation, tarot, palmistry, astrology. Robert, still unaware of the breadth and depth of her experiences, saw that she was patient and answered each person as best she could, but he was already worried about the sheer bombardment of questions she was getting. Once Deanna mentioned how she was always arguing with her younger sister. She acts like she's my mother or something. That's because she was, Brenda said evenly, when you two were a family in the 1400s. How did you know that? Deanna exclaimed. I'm not sure, Brenda replied, stirring her coffee at the head of the table. One evening stood out in particular. Brenda was fielding the usual questions from her study group, now totally concentrated on otherworldly topics each weekend, when she paused, looked around the table, and said quietly, "Someone wants to come in." She took one deep breath and exhaled, and Robert noticed a literal change in her expression. A voice spoke, and it did not sound exactly like Brenda. "My name is Hewitt. Are those walnuts I see in the bowl?" Brenda had provided some snacks for the group, and an assortment of nuts was heaped in a glass container in front of her. "I love walnuts. I'd forgotten how good they taste." Brenda began eating only the walnuts, but Robert was convinced this was not Brenda eating the walnuts. The members in the room were electrified with anticipation. "Hewitt, where are you from?" "Scotland, lass." And Brenda did indeed speak with a slight brogue now. "Hewitt, what do you do in Scotland? What year is it you come from?" The questions were innumerable. "I think the year is, I don't know. I didn't go to town much. I just tended my sheep. Last time was fairly lonely, but I enjoyed my life then." I'm going to need a tape recorder, Robert thought to himself. "I need to go now," Hewitt said, some time after finishing off the walnuts. "She tells me it's time for me to go." And just like that, he was gone. Brenda was back. She blinked her eyes, looked around the room, and said, "What happened?" To say the room exploded with excitement would be an understatement. Brenda's friends clamored for more information from her, calling out as she moved around the table, responding to questions in her light meditations. As the weekly meetings progressed, Robert became more concerned. He was not as enthusiastic as a room full of schoolmates. He had seen a different side of this transaction before. Robert remembered what happened to Brenda one evening a few months before their daughter was born. "Someone wants to speak," she said, as they were preparing for sleep. Robert was sitting next to her, on the side of the bed, taking his shoes off. These conversations had already become a part of their personal life. Brenda had not revealed this to anyone else yet. As she would do with her school friends later, Brenda would inhale deeply, close her eyes, and when they opened again, she would be gone, and someone else would be talking in Brenda's voice. Robert was aware of Hewitt, the old Scottish farmer. He often spoke to Lois. He said she'd been a high priestess somewhere in South America, perhaps in the 1200s. Her specialty was healing, and Robert tried to remember or write down everything she said, happy to be given helpful tips on health and well-being. But not every interaction was so sanguine. He had been looking forward to another such visit as they undressed for bed that evening, when Brenda's head cocked to one side and viewed him narrowly. "Hello?" There was no response. Brenda's eyes darted back and forth, then blinked. It was as if someone or something was learning the controls of an instrument for the first time in a long time. "My name is Robert. What is yours?" "My name is Simon." The words seemed to slither from the lips as much as spoken. "How can I help you, Simon?" Robert asked, not quite sure what to make of this individual he had not heard from until now. "Oh, I can do things for you," Simon replied, the words almost dripping off his lips. "Sexual things." Robert's eyes narrowed slightly. This was not what he had expected, and he was rapidly discerning there was something drastically wrong with this interaction with this spirit. "Who are you? Who were you before, Simon?" The face went slack for a moment, as if Simon was thinking of a far-off memory. "I was a prisoner in Auschwitz." A dark place and time, Robert reflected. And now this dark entity had entered his wife. Would he ever leave? Robert remembered something about devils and Faustian bargains from his high school English classes. If Simon wanted to grant sexual favors, as he put it, what did he want in return? Robert took a breath, almost afraid to continue. "Simon, let's say I like your sexual favors. What do you want?" A demented grin crossed Brenda's face. "I get 2 for 1. The baby too." Robert's blood ran cold. The hair actually stood up on the back of his neck, like in the movies, but this was no movie. My God, Robert thought. He inhabits the body, he banishes the soul, and I can never tell anyone. No one would believe me. What had started out as a simple conversation at the side of the bed was now a turning point in his life, in the life of his family. There was only one thing he could think of to do. "Oh, Jesus, I call on you to free this entity from my wife. He does not belong here. Please help my family. I plead for your help in my hour of need." Robert closed his eyes and prayed. And in a moment, he felt a calm come over him. He opened his eyes and looked to Brenda. He could see instantly that she was back. "Oh my God, Brenda, what was that? What happened to you?" Brenda blinked her eyes and composed herself, releasing a sigh of relief. "I left, thinking you would be in good hands with Simon, but he lied to me, and by the time I realized who he was, it was too late. He was already in." "Let's say a prayer for Simon." "What?" "I understand how he felt the way he did. It was not his fault." Robert prayed that Jesus would deal gently but firmly with Simon. He struggled to find a way to express his gratitude for having his wife and child back again. No one would ever know how close he came to losing them. But he would remember it forever, his faith thoroughly cemented in the goodness of God. The pregnancy continued with no further complications, Robert and Brenda becoming the proud parents of a daughter that summer. In years to come, she looked just like her mother, and, Robert suspected, had the same dreams. Once, Brenda was just putting Shauna, the baby, down for her nap, when she turned to Robert and said, "Harma wants to visit with the baby for a moment. She's an Earth Mother type on the other side. Would that be okay?" Robert nodded. "If it's okay with you." Brenda paused for a moment, and the baby gazed up, as if into the eyes of another being. Robert watched the baby's face change into the most unearthly smile he had ever seen, like the dawning of the sun. It was a look of total recognition and love, of someone she recognized absolutely, just not from this world. Soon the weekly meetings were attracting Brenda's friends and friends of friends. People came knocking at the door, up into the wee hours, as Brenda was peppered with question after question, some legitimate, others silly or interrogatory to the point of rudeness. "So this is how Jesus felt in the multitudes," Robert mused to himself one Friday evening, seeing the cars parked up and down the street in front of their home. He worried about his wife. To hell with answering all these people's silly questions. It was plain they were wearing her down week by week. He kept a list of people who came and things they asked. It appeared that Brenda was conversant in tarot, palmistry, precognition, past life reading, astrology, telepathy, and of course, mediumship. She had become the Alison Dubois for her group. Robert was growing increasingly worried about the notoriety this was starting to bring. This went on for over a year, and while Brenda was glad to help others, it was clearly taking a toll on her health. Eventually, Brenda agreed to stop the meetings when she realized that she was having heart palpitations from the stress of readings. Robert was relieved when the crowds of people, suddenly no longer getting their weekly deluge of data, which he noticed they neither appreciated nor utilized, just as suddenly disappeared from their life. Robert hoped she would get some form of recognition or recompense for her trouble, but Brenda would not hear of it, even if it had been offered. People always seem to want something for nothing, he mused. She gave freely, but the recipients neither used this help to enrich their own lives nor that of the giver. It was better this way. Better to retire, so to speak, from the public arena which Brenda had been pulled into. Not all was lost, however. Brenda retained an abiding love of healing, and spent many hours studying home remedies based on herbs, plants, and all things of the earth. These things she shared with others from time to time, but she was careful to consider the individual and whether they had the heart to receive the information she was able to give them. Brenda told him repeatedly that she could not see past the year 2000 for some reason. To her mind, in the physical, as she always referred to it, that meant her time was up. She would not live past 2000, that's why she saw nothing. "I'm happy with my life, Robert. Please don't be upset," she would say with a smile, patting his hand. "I've already lived twice as long as any other life." "And it's all your fault," she would say with a wink. Robert always tried to be the optimist in the face of such depressing thoughts, until one day in September 2001. Robert began to suspect there may be other reasons why she could not see past that year. Perhaps powers of darkness had dropped a curtain to hide something about to happen. He was watching TV from the kitchen as the second plane hit the Twin Towers. He remembered all too well how Brenda had suffered through years of sleepless nights, and when she would awake she explained some tragedy, sometimes in great detail, and sure enough, on the evening news there would be the story she had described. On this day, as Robert watched the rising death toll announced minute by minute, he recoiled in horror, and only partly because of what was happening on the TV screen. He could only imagine those flailing beings crying out. He knew Brenda was still in bed, and she was dreaming. And he knew she was hearing each one of them as they fell. He shuddered involuntarily. This time the buildings came crashing down, and Brenda found herself wandering through piles of smoking rubble, smelling the putrid aroma of dead bodies. She came upon a lone figure in the ruins who gazed longingly at her, then glanced down to a littered pile of debris, then back to her, as if to say, "Help me, I'm right here." Brenda looked down and saw a dirty hand exposed in the rubble, the nails broken. She reached out to touch the broken fingers, and then the rubble fell away, and all Brenda was holding was a hand, the flesh ripped from the radius bone it had been attached to. "My God, what has done this?" Brenda thought, but she amazed herself at the way she methodically searched, ignoring the usual waves of terror and fear all around her. She realized she was doing her work, and this had been her workplace for as long as she could remember. She was no longer afraid. She rescued, in many cases, not the body, but the soul of each terrified person she met, soothing their fear and directing their path back to all that is. She was helping them to come home. After September 11, 2001, Brenda gradually revealed what she could figure from her dreams, more for Robert's benefit than her own. When the world began, she told him, the Earth was composed of 24 energy columns. 12 of these were light energies, 12 were dark. "Right, always maintaining a balance between good and evil," Robert interjected. Brenda corrected him gently, as always. "Well, no, don't think of it as good versus evil. But where there is light, there must be darkness, and they should always be evenly matched. Anyway, as I was saying, with the attrition of time and the misdeeds of mankind, the columns began to dissipate, leaving more and more imbalance. This was usually manifested in the world as advances of civilization." "Or the retreat of civilization?" Robert interjected. "Yes, that too," Brenda replied. "There was a time, for example, when the Muslim world was more advanced or civilized than other cultures like Western Europe, let's say. Eventually the columns dissipated, one by one, from mankind's inattention, until there were only 6 left. When was this? Robert was always ready with another question. Probably the latter part of the 20th century, I'm guessing, Brenda added. Yes, but which was which? There were 3 dark columns, and only 2 light. I thought you said there were 6, Robert asked, quizzically. Brenda shook her head slowly. Until recently, there were, and it was given to me to, shall we say, erase the difference. She continued, choosing her words carefully. Each column was assigned a column worker, and that person took on the essence of the column they protected. What do you mean about persons, and you had to erase the difference? You mean... Balance must be maintained, was all Brenda would say. It was then that Robert understood that there was more than sadness that filled Brenda's dreams. It was a resolve. It was her calling. One day the Earth will regenerate all 24 energy columns again. The Earth will survive. Brenda could not answer Robert's last question, however. Brenda had accepted that these were more than just dreams she was having. She called it traveling. This was the same work as when she dreamed of an ill child, surrounded by weeping relatives, gathered around its bed. She had come just to help the child and direct energy where it was most needed, but there had been unexpected consequences. A few weeks later, she was doing her weekly shopping at the local market when a Hispanic lady stopped her, fell to her knees, and started crying, reaching for Brenda's hand. Dios mío, fue usted, bendita mujer. Muchísimas gracias. Te vi en la cama con Benjamin. Brenda felt a little embarrassed by such a public display, but she knew the woman was thanking her for helping a grandson who had a high fever, but was obviously well now. She had not realized that she must have appeared to more than just a little boy in that room that night. It was all in a night's work to her. She smiled and gently helped the sobbing woman to her feet. Thank you, but it was not me, but God, who is all that is, who helped your grandson. I was just a helper. Brenda hoped the poor woman understood. Her gift grew year by year after that, as she used it to guide others to find a helpmate, a job, a lost relationship. Guided by the ghostly visitors she'd come to accept as much as a part of the universe as the sparrows, or the blue sky, or the sibilance of a quiet brook. Yes, she decided, acceptance really was everything. In the end, that was the greatest gift she had to teach, and all other miracles flowed from it, and were not even miracles, except to those who insisted upon it. There were the dreams of people with illness, people with broken hearts, and when she woke up, she knew it was not even a dream. Sometimes she awoke and knew their cancer was gone. Other times she knew the soul was ready to depart, and that was good for those who had lived their life and were ready to move on. If they were confused as they got up from their bed for the last time, she was there to help them back across the border to the wonderful world their soul had momentarily forgotten. Once, Robert had a persistent infection. He had tried the usual doctor visit with antibiotics, but it didn't seem to ever completely go away. He mentioned it to Brenda one evening at the dinner table. She nodded. "I'll ask about it," was all she said. Later that evening, watching the TV, Robert noticed Brenda had moved to the dining room table again with her hands palm up on her lap. "I'm charging," she said quietly. "Come over here, please." Robert took a seat next to her. Brenda got up and placed her hands directly on his belly. Her hands felt warm, almost hot. "What does this—" "Shh! Don't talk right now," Brenda replied to Robert's usual immediate questioning. Robert closed his eyes and breathed a gentle sigh. He could feel Brenda's hands move slightly up, then over, as if searching for a particular area. She took a deep breath, then exhaled just as deeply. "Okay, I'm done." "What do I do now?" Robert asked. "Nothing. Let's just see what that does." A week later, Robert had been working in the study for over an hour before he absently reached to his belly and realized there was no need, for he had no more pain, and had not for several days. He never needed to see the doctor again about that particular ailment either. There were many people like herself, Brenda often told him, and yet the universe scattered them like seeds across the earth, far enough apart that they never knew each other in person, yet close enough that their love and care enveloped a world that did not know them, or even that it needed them. Acceptance was everything she knew, and it had taken her a lifetime to learn it. It helped to know that finally she was not alone, and never had been. If she lived forever, there was no better motto than this: have you ever been paid a kindness? Pass it on. Pass it on. Robert remained her loving husband as long as they lived, and there were always the dreams, years of them. Brenda grew older, following ghostly visits from Jerry as he led her to soothe a crying baby or hold a grieving mother's hand, except many of these people never knew her, nor lived in her town, or even her country. "I'll see you in my dreams," she remembered as a child, and knew it to be true. Still, life is not always lovely, and neither were the dreams. She would wake, she would sleep, awaken and sleep, jerk awake again, and knew she was being called. It was useless to try to stop it. It was what she signed up for. She resorted to endless card games of solitaire, or crossword puzzles, or mindless computer games late into the night, her husband reading in the front room alone. "He's wondering what he's got himself into," she mused sadly, and knew it was true, but also true that he accepted her as is unconditionally. Brenda did speak to her neighbors on occasion, even as reclusive as she was. One of her new friends looked in on her almost daily, usually holding a magazine or religious reading material from the day's mail. Jenny enjoyed discussing such things with Brenda, kind of like crib notes for eternity. This morning there was an article about Mother Teresa. "What a woman!" Jenny exclaimed, looking over the magazine. "Too bad there are so few like her. Remember all the holy people back in the Bible? Why can't it be like it was then, when you ran into a holy person almost every day?" Brenda smiled to herself. Yet the universe scattered them like seed across the earth. "I reckon the world is more constant than you might think," Brenda reminded her. "As far as saints, you never know." She shifted in her wicker chair, pointing across the street. "I mean, who lives in that house over there?" "I have no idea, Brenda." Brenda continued. "Who is to say miracles don't happen in that house right now? There are so many people in the world today, and we know so very few of them." "I guess so," Jenny replied. "The only house I'm worried about is mine. I'm just afraid of being alone. I'm already 28, and there's nobody I can talk to except you." Brenda touched her friend's hand and knew the general outline of the husband-to-be, but that was next year. It was already unfolding. Jenny just had to be patient and watchful. That was the hardest thing for most people. "Don't worry," Brenda replied softly. "You will be fine. You deserve the happiness you seek, and it will come." Jenny squeezed her hand. "Oh, Brenda, if I could only believe that." "Believe it," Brenda insisted. "It will happen." Brenda longed for the day when she would sleep and never wake up, if that was all her life was to be. Robert always made her feel better, and she felt like she was almost a wife, and her life was almost her own. Her only fear was that something would happen to Robert and she would be alone, without her anchor in this world. It was good to be a helper, but she was also glad knowing that one day it would be over. She had become very tired lately. Jerry was with her almost every day now, hovering, waiting. His thoughts came more as pictures, with brief snatches of flowing words she knew were not English, or any other language she had ever heard in the physical. There have been many blessings in your life, Brenda. As you find them again, you will know more about God than you could ever imagine. Come with me and let us tell the world what we know. Well done, good and faithful servant. She closed her eyes and took Jerry's hand. She turned one last time and kissed Robert, loving him with all her heart. He would be sad, but she would be in his dreams forever, until they were together again. This marks the end of Brenda's earthly story, but also the beginning of the rest of her life. She hopes that her story helps you in your sojourn here, my friend. For those who would like to hear more from Brenda herself, she wrote of her psychic travels in another set of books, Stone Book 1, Sapphire, and Stone Book 2, Amethyst, pseudonym B. J. Jewel, which you can find on Amazon.com.